Hi everyone, welcome to story time. You might notice me looking a little bit different today. I'm very excited because I've got a story with a bunny inside it. And it's not just any bunny, it's probably one of the most famous bunnies of all. It's all about little Peter Rabbit. So I thought that I might wear my bunny glasses and my bunny ears, but they're not so good for reading with, so I might put them aside until a little bit later on, and we might jump into the story of little Peter Rabbit. The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. Once upon a time there were 4 little rabbits. Their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out," she said. Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the woods to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. Oh dear, he is taking a big risk. And then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages. And he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he'd forgotten his way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have got away altogether if he had not unfortunately run into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears. But his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop on top of Peter. But Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a watering can. Would have been a beautiful thing to hide in, had it not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each one. Presently, Peter sneezed. "Achoo!" Mr. McGregor was after him in no time at all, and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time, he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to a family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. a white cat was staring at some goldfishes. She sat very, very still. But now and then the tip of her tail twitched, as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He'd heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard a noise of a hoe. Scratch, 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 scratch. Peter scuttled underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeked over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Oh, thank goodness for that. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go along a straight walk behind some blackcurrant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him in the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten away blackbirds. It would have been better to try and find something to scare away Peter Rabbit. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand of the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he'd done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well during that evening. His mother put him to bed and made him chamomile tea. And she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoon to be taken before bedtime, she said. But Flopsy, Mopsy and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. Well, that's a nice reward for some very well-behaved bunnies, isn't it? I think it's good that Peter perhaps learned his lesson about going into Mr. McGregor's garden. I wonder if that will be the end of Peter's adventures. I'm by no means sure that that's the case. And that's the end of our story. Ready? Hi everyone! I thought it might be nice for us to sing a bunny song together. It's all about little Peter Rabbit who found himself with a fly upon his nose. And I'm going to sing it through once and then I'll sing it through a second time and hopefully everybody out there will join in with me. Are you ready? A little Peter Rabbit had a fly upon his nose. Little Peter Rabbit had a fly upon his nose. Little Peter Rabbit had a fly upon his nose. So he flipped it and he flopped it and it flew right away. Zzz. Do you think you can sing it with me? And do the actions. A little Peter Rabbit had a fly upon his nose. A little Peter Rabbit had a fly upon his nose. A little Peter Rabbit had a fly upon his nose. So he flipped it and he flopped it and it flew right away. Bzzz. Oh, that was lovely singing, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Have a lovely rest of the day. See you next time. Bye.